Colin, what first? Tell me about this new show and what you've called it.
Yeah, I've called it material culture, but it's something that archaeologists particularly, I think, is a phrase they use to describe artefacts, really. And obviously the fact that there are lots of material references. Some things, like these wardrobe paintings, it's more overt. But then gradually it's become more reduced into something a little bit more formal, less sort of literal, I suppose.
What is your starting point?
I mean, these more recent ones with the sort of conical columns, they're all the same. There was a series of them that are all the same proportion, the same format, the same amount of reduction from top to bottom or bottom to top, because I wanted some element that didn't change, and that became a kind of template to then, for instance, these two paintings here, the design is exactly the same without the patterning, of course, but the structure is the same. But you get a very different feel from them, and that's probably a bit, without sounding presumptuous, a bit like what Rothko was doing with his rectangles. So, he wanted to limit down the motif, if you like, so that it was the edges and the colour and the touch, and so they really spoke louder. He didn't change it all the time, so you became distracted by that.
Is there also, am I at all right in thinking, something of Matisse? I think of that just because of the sort of decorative aspects of it.
I don't think my ambition is to be decorative. I think the sensuality of the paint and the colour and the lusciousness of it, if you like, is just a trap. It's just a lure to make you... the same way, flowers are beautiful to attract bees. They're not for our pleasure. The aesthetic qualities have a function. A huge influence on me has always been Richard Diebenkorn, and I think how he interpreted Matisse was very exciting, very interesting. And he went to the Hermitage, I believe, in the 60s, and he came back a changed man because of the Matisses, and a very, very big fan of him. I've always liked his work, actually.
Would you consider yourself primarily a representational artist?
Always, yeah. I always have been. But I was tutored in the times when late modernism was very much at its height, and subject matter was completely... any form of representation or depiction was completely verboten. And we were under the whip of Greenberg's diktats, and but very early on, I just felt I didn't want to be caged in by those ideas, and it was never a conscious choice that I made. But I became very under the spell of film, really, how it had kind of conditioned my imagination. It wasn't something I consciously did, but it particularly came out when I went to live in New York, because I felt I knew you had a feeling from the massive sort of amount of media we were exposed to, our generation particularly, I think, more American than... You had a feeling that you knew about America, but actually to go and live there, you suddenly found actually not really at all. It was very... it's a very sort of artificial construction. And so I think some of the work kind of explored that. Although I never felt the paintings were narrative. I don't really like the idea of narrative paintings, because I think other media deal with narrative so much more effectively. I think paintings are much more mysterious, the way that it kind of references things, but not in a sort of linear or obvious way. It kind of can evoke things, I think.
Do you operate off a black ground when you paint? Because black seems to, in a way, be a sort of unifying element.
There's definitely an air of melancholy in a lot of the work, I think. And but no, I don't actually use a black ground. I tend to use... It took me ages when I was a student and slightly after to realised that the painting didn't really start to sort of come to life until all the white was gone. The primer was gone. So the white then suddenly meant something. It wasn't just everywhere. And so now I tend to use just put a flat colour on. Quite often quite a warm colour, but try and vary it, and you can sometimes see it. But I'm always very aware of the tonal structure of the painting. And I'm always thinking about where's the darkest area going to be, where's the lightest area. Where you tend to get the contrast is where you tend to focus psychologically as well as visually, because they're linked, of course. Whether you're conscious of it or not. I think it's a very... it's like Eliot said, you don't have to understand a poem to be moved by it. You don't have to understand how it works to be moved by it. It affects you anyway.
And not from photographs?
I'm a huge fan of photography, but I just think it's very different. There are links, but I don't think it's at the core of the nature of painting. They were all trained as draftsmen, the early photographers, and they really knew how to frame up the subject, and get everything, every element of the photograph looking like it should be there. You couldn't alter it, even the not important literal things. If you look at a Cartier-Bresson or something like that, you couldn't change anything, without destroying. And that's something that a good painting has as well. Mm. That's something I really look for in photography as well, that every part of the photograph is doing something. It's adding to the whole thing. Yeah.
And I suppose there lies the danger, doesn't it? I mean, that if you're making figurative art or an art of representation, people find that there's almost no difference between what it is you're depicting and what they are.
What you're saying, in a sense. So, I think so. I think that goes back to that issue of the subject matter, literalness, and people. We talked about it earlier, but one of the things that I sort of like is that something stimulates a possible narrative, but it's theirs. I think all good artists, filmmakers, authors, musicians, I'm sure too, realise that you have to leave some work for the audience to do. And I think if you tell them too much, it becomes, it pushes you out. I think it's actually just getting them interested enough to to start the imagination working. I think it's very important. I think that's possibly why a lot of artists and writers become more reductive. Somebody like Beckett getting much more reductive as he went along, giving you just real sort of rich nuggets of information that just trigger something, and then there's a void that you have to fill.
I mean, that's what I think is one of the exciting things about your pictures, which is the sort of mystery of the human presence, because the human presence is there, but in lots of ways you make it deliberately tangential.
I actually didn't want to make it recognisable as a portrait of somebody. It was more of, I think I'm stealing Bacon's phrase there, but it was a sort of portrait of a feeling or a mood rather than a specific person.
Yes, and you can see that in the sense that, at least for me, it's almost as if it's a sort of frame from a film, and you're having to supply the rest of the story. So everything is. Sure. The frame is just is part of the story in a way.
Well, I sort of like that it's kind of hinting at a narrative, but it's almost like a Rorschach test. It's actually saying more about you. But I like that. That's good. I mean, I like that. The painting being a kind of catalyst for imagination to just trigger something, and not quite Proustian sense, but it brings other things up for people. People are always very conscious of the literal subject matter in depictive or figurative painting, but it's as important, if not more important, is how it's made, not just what's in it, and that's something that I think a lot of people who aren't artists or never actually engaged in making those kind of objects, they don't really get that. They think it's all about the subject matter, and really the subject matter can actually be deliberate, almost a blind. It can be actually hiding something rather than revealing something. And I think your father Richard wrote something very nice about my work once, and he talked about the complexity of subject matter and how tricky it can be. I think in a sense I was trying to evoke this sense of a presence without actually depicting the person, you know, so perhaps in the shirts or the overcoats and things you get a kind of a sense that they've been lived in. It's actually an excuse for making a certain kind of painting actually, and I think quite early on I felt a lot of possibilities with the idea of the relationship between cloth and the way that paint kind of drapes. You kind of drape the paint on sometimes, and the fluidity of it and the fluidity of the way that cloth falls is something very sympathetic, I think. The subject matter, I think of it as object matter rather than subject, because it's just another element. You've got, you know, as you say, colour, you've got, it's always important to me there's an illusion of volume. The sort of magic of the transformation of 3D into 2D is something that if it's not there, I find it, I hesitate to use the word boring, but it takes away a lot of the excitement for me of the process. So it's that kind of magic that it's flat, you can see it's flat, you can see it's paint. I've never tried to hide the fact that it's paint, but it also alludes to volume and to a certain kind of sensual experience.
You've travelled about quite a bit. How
on the road?
We've been on the road.
On the run.
On the run. On the road. On the road. Do you consider yourself a British artist or an English artist?
I don't feel very British at all as a person or as an artist. I suppose the YBA's changed a lot of the idea of what British art is. You know, the Chapmans and Damien Hirst and those people. But again, I don't think I might be quite ironic as a person, but I don't think my art's particularly ironic.
I mean, these pictures seem to me, completely the opposite of YBA art, because they seem to demand that you look at the pictures, so they don't declare themselves or they don't tell you what they are immediately, which is unlike.
I'm glad you say that. I'm glad you say. But I wonder, how, you actually get people in the current sort of climate of everything being, sound, Marsh and McLuhan, the boom, the sound bite, I think the attention span, you need to do something to re-engage that. I'm not quite sure how you do that. Whether it can ever be done, I don't know.
Colin, can I ask you about time of day? A lot of the pictures seem as if they're made at the sort of at the end of the day, and it also seems that some of the pictures might be painted at night. How? What is your relationship to daylight?
Of course, it's a photographers and filmmakers thing, isn't it? Magic hour. But for the time I spent in Sweden, I was very interested in the time, because you get very long dusks in Sweden. The twilight lasts a couple of hours. It's not very quick like it is in the tropics. And there's a real dialogue between where the natural light dominates the artificial light, and then gradually it switches to the artificial light. And it's a really interesting time. It's not just lighting, it's not just the low sun casting long shadows or anything, or the richness of the colour of the sun or anything. It's actually the relationship between the artifice and the natural thing that I've always found quite interesting. And it's very evocative too of a mood, I think. Yeah.
I mean, which makes me want to ask about, in a way, any pictures that, and this has maybe bedeviled a lot of, whether American artists or British artists that deal with stuff, which is its relationship to pop art. I mean,
sure.
So is it about, in any way, commodity or?
You mean the artwork itself, or the subject matter?
Well, are your paintings can they be read as pop art in any way?
Somebody asked me that once before, and I said, not these paintings particularly, but the more figurative, more overtly figurative work. I described it as sort of dirty pop, and in the sense that it was kind of gritty, But it was a lot, so in some sense, derived from what would be considered popular culture. I was very keen on what we call the dirty realists, the writers in the States, Raymond Carver, Jane Ann Phillips, Richard Ford. For quite a long time I was very, liked very much that they took very sort of grounded sort of subject matter and did something quite special with it. It was also deeply humanist, but it was it was very, it was kind of a social realism, but without the sort of worthiness of social realism. I'd hate to think that any element of my lived life is not available to be used in the work.